is actually represented in her books. Take, for instance, she talks about multiple map representing multiple ideas about Lagos. To me, that is very instructive, especially during the Victorian era. I mean, Lagos during this period was a space for ideological contestation, not just between the Victorian elites, even among the the political colonial administrator and the missionaries. And reading our books, you see how effectively map was used to project certain part of the city in order to get favorable um, favorable sanction from the colonial office in London. And another part of the book also talks about how the book offers an insight into the socio-cultural life of the people. We've been dealing with archival records on Lagos for the past 60 years. But when you place a map on the table, what does it tell you about the common man without the big names? History from below. When you reading our books, you get to understand that map can actually bring about to correct this idea of what Matthew Gandhi refers to as historiographies of absence, where certain individuals that when you go through archives, their voices are silent, then she probably call our attention to looking at map, not just Lagos, beyond Lagos now. This is quite a very innovative methodology, probably to reinterpret the history of colonial Nigeria using map in conjunction with other sources. Like what she did by calling our attention to the danger of relying on archival records alone, going to the mapping and what do you call it, colonial records, not just colonial records, but the court records of the fight in Lagos in the 19th century over land possessions, how she was able to tally that with idea of politics of mapping. Who owns the space? How do you represent the ownership of spaces in record gathering and record documentation? She actually used map to bring to the fore some of these, because in the 19th century, especially under Glover, the possession of land depends on your relationship with colonial government, not just the evidence you possess, but your attitude and your politics with the colonial government determines what you own to a very large extent. So using court record and map, reveal some of the post-colonial problems that Lagos faced, especially in the present era, where you have court cases over lands that I know of family that they've been in court for the past 50 to 70 years. I mean, so these are problems created by colonial government, how spaces were mapped, shared, and evidences were destroyed. So our work is calling our attention to, we should look back to the methodology of engaging urban history. Moving further, she also talks about, okay, let me go back to the title, Imagine Lagos. And I ask the question, why not Imagine Eko? To me, they represented the two different faces, Imagine Lagos and Imagine Eko. What is Lagos? What is Eko? Maybe Ademide will help us to clarify that. And secondly, I also noticed in about chapter 1, chapter 2, a use of word, illiterates. The people, the locals who are not, mostly who are illiterate. And I ask the question, how do you determine somebody who is an illiterate? To me, those are issues that, though quite minute, but it's actually a serious issue that we should engage in our everyday conversation about colonial Africa. How do we classify an illiterate in Africa, for instance? And also, but in conclusion, the idea of mapping Lagos has also, bring to the fore places like Ofi, Itolo, Okeani. These are places that was occupied by average Lagosians, basically the poor. But if you go to the archives, you hardly find documents about Itolo, Okeani, Ofi. So that tells you the repression in archival document of ordinary people. Now, Ademide is calling our attention to those places. What happened during the colonial era? What happened to people in that area? I think if you get a copy of Ademide's book, you'll be able to see that in the recent times, probably this is one of the most important books, written on urban history in Lagos. That's good. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Okay, Mark. Sorry, Mark. So I just want to get back to you. I wonder if you can have about 2-3 minutes to come.
All right. Thank you. So I was just, I think, touching on methodology and my admiration for how Ademide went about walking the city and mapping the city, and just recognizing how difficult that can be, how exhausting Lagos can make that. And then turning to my second comment, how she did it was extremely innovative, extremely well executed. And she touches on this, that this is kind of like a common thing in other cities, walking tours, exploring the city on foot. It's kind of a very modern way to engage with, urbanism. And in some contexts, that kind of mode of, kind of being a has been about, a privileged gaze, or kind of how we're perceiving and interpreting the city for others. So I would have been interested at some points in the book if there had been more of an engagement with some of the literature around, she talks about a lot about the problems, the way that maps lie, that they're not empirical representations of reality. In the same way that maps lie, our eyes lie too. We perceive the world differently. How our field of vision works is culturally rooted. And I think there's a lot of interesting literature, especially on Yoruba aesthetics, on Yoruba architecture, on Yoruba art, that could have been brought in at places in the book. So much of it is trying to kind of reconstruct what the built environment looks like. And so I thought maybe a future project, or kind of an additional article thinking about actually visual perceptions of the city at street level, the materiality of the city, the aesthetics of the people standing on the same street corner. The landscape of the city can look entirely different and convey very different meanings. And there's a lot of interesting directions this could go in. And I think there's little tidbits in historical observations of the city, about bundles of goods or sticks that indigenous Yoruba people would leave on trees or to protect property, and how that just totally baffled and confused the colonial observers, but how there was this whole kind of symbolic landscape present that was invisible to outsiders. My third comment was just talking about how I really appreciated the kind of the book honing in and focusing on this episode of the bombardments. I can just wrap up with a question or two. I'm mainly just interested to hear Ademide kind of reflect on what's next, kind of future projects, and something I'm thinking about as well. I think, as I mentioned, a lot of our work is complementary. I think in the past, it's been good that we haven't cross-pollinated too many of our ideas. I'm interested to hear what she's thinking about. And I'm especially interested in this 1891 map that's like hyper detailed of Lagos. I think there's not enough has been done with it. And I'm curious if she has thoughts on what could be done with that map. There's, at the individual building plot level, it surveys this. So I'm very, very.
Where can we? Our final discussant, is Alima Somoton. Can we have you now, Ms. Alima?
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me? Okay, great. Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to hear everyone's reflection and the kind of overlap with some of the things that I find insightful about the book. And I really want to congratulate Ademide for this amazing, and I'm also going to use the term innovative because that was one of the things that came to my mind as I was reading the book. And, as someone who works in the 20th century, I think one of the things I appreciate about the book is that it allows me to imagine, and again, I'm going to use the title of the book, a different kind of Lagos and place some of the, and situate some of the places that I study, like Central Lagos, for example, that was demolished in the 1950s, within a much more longer historical context, to be able to challenge the idea that these places did not change before the 20th century, but that they have a much more longer and a very dynamic and very innovative and interesting ways in which the people who live there actually transform the space. And another thing that's really quite amazing, and before I go into the intervention, I just want to talk about what does this really mean for an average reader? Whether or not, you're an academic or not, one of the ways that I found this very transformative, when we think about African history, is how it really emphasizes the notion of space and placemaking, and also the importance of local perspective. And why does this matter? It matters because when you think about ways in which the city is often described historically, people tell you, you have different quarters, Isaleko and whatnot, right? But the idea of actually moving into those spaces and thinking about how do the people who live in these spaces actually organize it? What are the kind of interests that they have? How do they distinguish between different spaces? You actually don't hear that a lot within the literature. So one of the blessings, one of the gifts that this book offers us is the ability to actually move beyond what is considered impenetrable and to actually see what the people within those spaces, how they were moving within the space. And I was at Anthony Hopkins' book talk earlier today. And one of the things that I also think how this book's, how Ademide's work also transforms our understanding is that when, Professor Hopkins is talking about the merchants like, JPL Davis or a lot of the Sierra Leonean merchants, you can't really understand their action without if you don't situate them within certain spaces. And this is the gift and the blessing that this book allows us to have. And another really important resonance is that when you try to think about what does the local really mean, what does the local really entail? She had a moment in, I think, one of the chapters whereby she talks about how a local person tried to give her directions. And she talked about how they were using houses rather than street addresses as a way of navigating the space. And this is really critical because when you think about ways in which other scholars have tried to understand the space, they're in the helicopter, or there's this idea that the city is not, you're not able to navigate it. And I think part of the gift that she offers us is the ways in which how much it matters to bring the spatial and local perspective together, because it not only transforms the understanding of the past, but also of the present and the future. So what I want to do now is to offer what I see as a critical intervention that the book makes in African history. So first, the author uses map, which, as she rightly noted, they're very much underused sources to write a history of environmental and spatial transformation on Lagos Island between 1845 and 1872. Second, the author foregrounds the environmental elements like the creeks, the lagoon, and the swamps that have shaped the city's past. And by emphasizing this environmental element, what she did is to open a new field of inquiry into the understudy. The author rightly points out the ecosystem have been put to the background when you think about the political history of Lagos. At the same time, too, within this history, you hear moments whereby they make reference to the lagoon or they make references to Kosoko in the 1845 saltwater war. right? Even the name of Lagos, it means lagoon in Portuguese. So you have the ways in which the environmental element had always been present in terms of how we think about the city, except it has been marginalized and placed to the background. So one of the beautiful things that this book does, it actually places those environmental elements as historical agents that transform critical political events, as well as the island topography and people's everyday experiences. So one of the questions that the book raises is how historians can recover the voices of indigenous inhabitants who preserve their history and oral traditions, but whose spatial intervention have been obscured in the written colonial records like maps, which have largely been used to frame their past. And she draws on a lot of maps that, as she said, none of the maps were created by indigenous Lagosians. And when you look at it, she has a really beautiful quote in the book, whereby she said, when we think about maps, they're part of what she called, quote, an imperial toolkit for shaping and claiming dominance over much of the global south. But what Ademide argues is that despite the limitation of maps, despite their colonial intention and how they are meant to sort of reflect the cartographers' ways in which to sort of map out the city's future and also impose their own understanding of how the space should be, we can actually use these sources, and she does use these sources, to reconstruct histories of indigenous urbanism that existed and changed both before and after British colonization. Most importantly, and this goes back to the innovative aspect, she not only analyzes maps, but she creates new maps. She gathers evidence from walking tours that extended over the course of 3 summers, looked at oral sources, missionary records, newspapers, photographs, colonial correspondences. The evidence that she draws on in this book is really quite rich, and again, very methodological, innovative, and it pushes out in a very different direction. And through this approach, Ademide illuminates how Omeko, which she calls the indigenous people, as well as Areko, in this case, the newcomers, how they inhabited the city, struggled over the city, transformed its built environment as they contended with civil wars, enslavement, and British colonial expansion. Most important, sorry?
Go ahead, please.
Can I go on?
Yes, you can.
Sorry? Okay,
can-
thank you.
you can,
So
go on.
as I was saying, this new spatial history of Lagos is also situated at the intersection of gender, social, and environmental history. And Imagine Lagos helps us, brings to life the stories of lesser-known figures, and also helps us to rethink the roles of prominent actors like the indigenous ruler in the story of Lagos. For example, in the first chapter on streets and placemaking, the author unearths the voices of ordinary Lagosians to show how power, gender, religion, and freedom worked in 20th century Lagos. We are introduced to women like Tijuiku, a traditional religious practitioner and priestess who was expelled from Lagos in 1869. Nonetheless, the woman was not erased from the city's landscape. Part of what was formerly known as Victoria Street, which was named after Queen Victoria, but now called Nnamdi Azikiwe Street, was named for Tijuiku, whose Yoruba names means shame death in English. Therefore, we can understand Nnamdi Azikiwe Street not solely as a place renamed after Nigeria's first president, but also as a site with a history of contestation over space, gender, and belonging. The history of Nnamdi Azikiwe Street and many others that the author compiled bring new insights into the lesser-known people and places that influenced 19th century Lagos. And again, I'm going to talk about the environmental significance because this really stood out to me a lot. And one of the things that's really striking here is that she helps us to understand how actually integrated or how they thought about the spaces as well as used it. So, for example, you learn about the ways in which the Omeko saw the swamps and the creeks as places to worship deities. And the creek also played a really significant role during the British bombardment of Lagos in December 1851. She talks about how the creek, Elegbata Creek, for example, was one of the sites that prevented the eastern part of Lagos from being completely totally destroyed. And she also gives us a sense of what it means for people to engage with the spaces by talking about how many people in Lagos would often navigate their ways around the creeks and the lagoon by using canoes across the island rather than walking. And one of the things that's really important here is that she helps us to understand that the people who live in Lagos built their lives around the city's ecosystem as their compounds and quarters were destroyed during moments of political strife and imperial expansion. So Ademide offers us an example about what it meant for people to live around their environments, destroy as well as rebuild the environment. These are questions that we continue to grapple with as we think about issues of climate change. So by central, and this environmental history approach is not just significant for the history of Lagos, but it's also significant in urban African history, because you have new work that are thinking about how do we think about different non-human elements within, like centering them within the course of history. So I'm thinking about the work of Tasha Richke Epskins, who writes on Madagascar, and she talks about the importance of thinking about what she called the modded human elements, in this case, the ancestors and spirits, in her own research on Mahanja, which is a port city in Madagascar. And recently, Professor Aderinto also writes about the course of history. And I think what Ademide, how she distinguishes herself, as well as she's adding to this literature, but also distinguishing herself through our methodology, through the ways in which she reads and the ways in which she creates maps, and the ways in which she also brings her experience as a walking cartographer to the story. And as many people have also referred to this, she's constantly admitting the limitation of our method, as well as the limitation of what we can actually learn from the sources as a way to eliminate the past. She calls the maps that she uses speculative, the maps that she creates, because they're meant to raise new questions rather than offer definite answers about the transformation of the built environment. And this is really quite critical when it comes to thinking about using map as a source of history. So in closing, I think one of the most critical lessons that I took from this book, and which may seem obvious, is that the city itself is an archive. And she goes back to that idea constantly. And why it may seem obvious because, again, as I mentioned, the idea that the city itself has history that can be unearthed is not something that a lot of people tend to contend with. Yeah. And it raises the question for me about how to do research. What if we actually begin a scholarly inquiry by walking the streets and observing its environmental elements, instead of looking first to the traditional archives that are kept and controlled by state and local communities? And the author challenges historians not just to read a source along the grain, as we often think about it, but to flip the record by bringing our knowledge of the built environment to reconstruct the past and question archival resources. And through a simultaneous conversation with the city space and multiple archival holdings, we can transform our understanding of the past and the future. And so I have some questions for the author. And I think one of the things that I was thinking about is, after finishing this book, which new questions about writing history and archiving the past have come up for you? And I'm also thinking about what kind of work do you think this book can do for people who are interested in, the preservation of the built environment, as well as much more people who are interested in conserving, our historical heritage. So those are some of my questions. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this book, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Wow, thank you very much. The discussants, we really had a very interesting discussion about the scholarly work of Ademide. Fantastic. Before we move on, I want to, before Ademide will answer or will respond to what the various discussants have mentioned about the work, we will allow questions from the audience. But before that, she's got something she would like to know after. Okay, so she will discuss that after. We might have asked her questions. But I'm sorry, let me just take a short lead. I have also read some aspects of this work. And in fact, it's like something that you cannot put down. It flows. If you are reading it, it flows, the language, the records. And it's something that it's unputdownable. I think I can put it in that way. But in spite of that, I have one or two areas that I will also like to, I would like her to pay attention to. When she was discussing one of the areas, the spaces in Lagos, she mentioned Iga to represent Isaleko. And by my own understanding, as an indigene of that area, using Iga belittles what that space called Isaleko really represents. In Isaleko, there are several of these Igas. The Oba's Palace, which is Gaidungon. We have Aronires Palace. We have Obadikoro's Palace. We have Monorogun Adodo's Palace, Olumegon, and so on and so forth within that space that represents Isaleko. So Isaleko cannot be reduced to the Oba's Palace alone, in spite of the fact that the Oba superintends over all of these areas. That's one area that I would like you to look into. Secondly, I noticed that land grants in colonial Lagos actually began in the era of Glover. And in one of your position in this work, you mentioned King Dosumo granting land to people. In fact, that was the true position, but instead of calling it land grants, I think it's better to say land allocation, because after allocating the land, Glover and subsequent colonial masters, gave the grants. I hope you can get that. For instance, when the people are returning from Ekpe, which is part of the discussion in your work, around 1862-63, land was, allocated by the king. But afterwards, it became a grant when each of these people, about 21 compounds in the area, were given crown grants by Glover, which today remains a major contestation in those issues when people from the area believe that the popular cliche in Lagos, made popular by musicians like Tony Ade and Benisa Obe, that had become an issue because even that land, that space, was initially, allocated by the king. And in this case, the same Dosumo. And the granting, the crown grant, was given by Governor Glover, such that each of these people hold on to the crown grants, and it become a symbol, an evidence of their space up to today. So I'll probably want you to look into that in your response. Now the floor is open.
Sorry. Just a clarification to your submission. Yeah. Are you recognizing?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Don't speak your loud.
No, look at it.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Dominic. What that I have not read the book, sir, but looking at the title and I saw mapping history and the places. That is what that attracted me to this discussion. So I want to ask, because I know in mapping an environment, you need a base map, something that you look at to now produce your own. Then you now represent your information in your own map. So I want to know how you source or where you got the base map from and the tool you use in creating this map. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes. Yes.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Abiodun. I've not read the book also, but I look forward to reading the book. I am curious about the issue of spaces and identity. I know there are Afro-Brazilians in Lagos, so I was looking at how spaces can be an environment for the creation of identity. And I'm also thinking about land and gender. I don't know if you covered that as well. And also conflicts between traditional rulers and colonial authorities. I think Dr. Decker alluded to power relations and hierarchy. So I'm thinking about is there any conflict between traditional rulers and colonial authorities regarding land and allocation of land? And also, if women are granted the right to own land, and if there are contestations between among gender and also power relations and hierarchy. So if you can talk about that, that would be great. Thank you.
Hello, good evening, everybody. My name is Ben Mendelsohn. I'd just be curious if you have the chance to speak about it, since we were discussing so much about, also haven't read the book yet, about the methodology, and Professor Seni was talking about the terminology around land. What is the relationship between land and the spatial method? How much do they intersect or not? Yeah, just a question on that.
Good afternoon. My name is Lawa Adams. Where is the book available? I was hoping someone else would ask.
I just want to say thank you so much to everyone who's here. Thank you so much. I'm completely and totally overwhelmed. Thank you to my panelists who are online. Thank you for all the kind words. Our work overlaps in such interesting and exciting ways. I mean, so many people who know me know how I've been going through this process for so long. So it's quite incredible that it's actually happening and it's a book now. So thank you so much for the response. I really do appreciate what everyone has said. I was hoping to be able to show you some of what they're talking about, but it looks like the screen is not particularly clear. So, well, we'll see what we can see. But basically, to answer some of the questions, so I actually don't use the term illiterate in the book. I actually just searched again. I actually don't use that term. Actually, what I describe is that Yoruba culture is so rich and beautiful in expressiveness, in culture, in dance, and people. And it's a shame that that stuff is not archived and written and actually talked about, and that people are actually written out of the city. So part of what I try to do is write Yoruba in the maps, put Oriki in the maps, put, all kinds of things and people in the maps, and which follows up with the base map question. Now with these maps, I do use a satellite map as my base map, and I use ArcGIS and other things. So, but that's kind of a longer story. And to go to the other question about, wait, hold on. There was a question about, from the discussants also, well, I'll talk about later work later, but there was also a question about conflict and land between traditional authorities and people. Yes, there are a lot of conflicts over land and competition for land. And as we heard this morning from Professor Hopkins, land in Lagos becomes very, very expensive and pricey very quickly after the bombardment. So actually apart from the large maps in the archives, which I can show you quickly, there are a lot of small maps that are drawn because of disputes and over actually, so whatever you call them, land grants, crown grants, whatever it is, people were giving away land. So whatever the term we use, the Obas were giving people land, and we have documentation of this. So that occurs in Lagos. And so for Ben's question, let me see if I can show you. So I tried to share my screen, but you can't really see it. But basically, I guess the main thing I'm trying to do in my work is that, I'm also a Lagosian, I have roots in Isaleko also and all of that. But one of the things I see is that as somebody who became a historian after being something else, part of what I saw is when I read about Lagos, I don't recognize it. And anybody who's here knows that when you're here, you're here, right? And when you're in Lagos Island, it's impossible to miss it. But part of what we see, so I'm really interested in digital humanities as well. And the book will have a website that's launching imminently. So, when I leave this room, I'll go back to work. So I think part of what we see in Lagos is mostly we see this kind of colonial Lagos, right? This kind of bird's eye view looking over the city. So the arrow is kind of pointing to Lagos Island, which you cannot see, unfortunately. But part of what I wanted to do in my book is that if you could see this, you'll see that because I spent a lot of time in the archive as a historian and other things, I started thinking that I had to leave the archive and actually walk in Lagos Island and actually get to know some of these places I was mapping. So what you see in the book is that the table of contents, every chapter is located at a particular intersection in Lagos, whether it's about bombardments, whether it's about prison, whether it's about justice, whether it's about streets and street culture, whatever it is. So every chapter has its own intersection in Lagos Island, because what happened with me is after finding maps of Lagos, actually accidentally, maybe 15 years ago, I started looking for them everywhere. And I'm really sorry you can't see this, but well, it will be available. But what I found about Lagos, and this is the IGA question that you asked me, what I was talking about there's actually a map of Lagos from 1859, where Glover calls it District of Iga. I don't know if you can see it. Can you see that? So this is the earliest map of Lagos Island from 1859. So what I write about is that is Isaleko. And you can see the boundaries that he's drawing, Ologbo, Faji, all these places. So just because the name is wrong, we know the name is wrong. But what I'm drawing attention to is this is how it was described. So we can't just look at maps and think, oh, we found the answer in that way. So part of what I started doing was, after doing a lot of research with maps, and this is the map that Mark is talking about, Lagos is actually plotted down to each individual compound. These maps are huge and they exist in the British National Archives. There's about 15 sheets. So they're huge maps that are actually geographically accurate. And these are the sources I say are underused. And so what I've done is that I did something we call georeferencing. And so that's Lagos, if you've seen my work before, you've seen this. That's Lagos Island right now. And underneath that is the map I was just showing you. And if I click on what I pre-recorded, you can actually see through the old map and look through the past at what was underneath Lagos Island, and it zooms in and out. So what I did was I walked around the whole of, well, not the whole, but a lot of Lagos Island, looking for old features like Balogun Square, places that are missing and that are gone, places that are described in old maps and old documents. And you can actually map all of these things. Anyway, it goes on. And so what I've done is I mapped out the old shoreline of Lagos Island, which you can actually see with Ademide and the old marina. So when you look at these maps so I do it now on satellite maps. So when you look at these maps of old Lagos, you can actually see the old lagoons, the old creeks. It's actually visible from the pattern of the roads. So if you go to Lake Street, that's where the lake used to be, Elegbata Street, all of the Salagogo streets. There used to be a lagoon there, all of these things. So when the flooding happens, when all these things happen, like the gap you can see in the top, I think you can see it right here. So when you walk in these neighborhoods and you see what's happening, Alakoro, Elegbata here, Elegbata Street is right, and Lake Street is right there. Our history is basically in the city. So when I talk about leaving the archive and actually walking in Lagos, me and my research partners, and Kwela Professor, who's not here. So basically what we did is we walked around some of the most important parts of Lagos Island. We identified a lot of the streets, the things that were important. And this is basically what I write about. And I guess I'll end by saying that, when you map Lagos, you can then talk about all kinds of things that happen in Lagos that people describe. So one of the things, so growing up in Lagos, I didn't learn a lot about slavery, probably like most people, right? I didn't know much about slavery, transatlantic slave trade. But so many of these episodes I found, one of them that's quite painful, we have 10 moments, is there's a man who, after the bombardment of Lagos in 1851, he came back and he confronted the chief in Idumota that enslaved him. He said, I know his house. So a missionary took him there, and he went and said, I bet you thought you would never see me again after you sold me to those people. There are so many things happening in Lagos Island that are documented that we can see. But so part of why I draw those maps is understanding that, we can place these things. When you think about breadfruits, there are breadfruit trees that used to be there. A crowd that talks about being enslaved and beaten there. People talk about weddings, marriage, all kinds of things you can map and you can place when you know where they are. And I guess I'll just end with, the thing about the 1891 map is something I've really become interested in, is actually trying to map out there was a survey in 1891 where the British government mapped out the whole of Lagos Island, which is the huge one I was talking about. And one of the things they did was try to create boundaries between what is different in Ologbo and Itolo and Ofin or Ekpetedo or whatever. So I've been tracing out those shapes and I didn't finish it in time for the book, but basically trying to trace out the shapes, the boundaries, and all the pieces. If you could read it, you would see that each of these things is named. and there's streets. It's not visible here, but you can see the streets, the boundaries, the shapes, and what is happening in all the parts of old Lagos. So to answer Mark's question about what is next, I mean, I'm still doing a lot of different things. I'm thinking about the later period and mapping Lagos. And also to go back to the lagoon question, also water is really important, right? This is like 5 Kauri Creek in the background of this map. And I'm really thinking a lot about water and the city and how just basically making Lagos history accessible for people like myself who didn't grow up, who lived here but didn't really grow up understanding where we were. So thank you. Oh, I forgot. August. It's coming out in July or August, and the PDF will be available soon. And the map and the website will be, depending on my internet, obviously, it will be available, I think, at the end, where all the maps and everything will be available, I believe, in July.
And the book in Lagos.
And the book in Lagos, well, I mean, I hope to come back soon, maybe in September or something. So yeah, I'm thinking about coming back with more copies. So it's not expensive. Yes, yes, please. Yes, by all means, place orders with me. Yes. Oh, by all means, obviously I want to come back. So yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It has been a stimulating and wonderful discussion. I hope we have all enjoyed ourselves listening to opinions of scholars about Imagine Lagos. I hope we still have another opportunity to read from Ademide and many of us who are on this line are getting something for us to be able to celebrate. This is a celebration of scholarship.
All right. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. It'll be out imminently. Thank you. Thank you.
Congratulations. To me, fantastic.
Thank you so much for your comments.
Now breaking methodology.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yes.
But till now, I don't believe I can read Lagos on one. But the idea of literature or something, I think it's just in line sometimes.
I just remember, sorry. The idea of Edun Shagbe. What is it? What is it? Edun Shagbe actually is Edun Shagbe is
She was actually working to keep that this money or something.
Yeah.
So Lagos have always been a city library very strong.
Exactly. Exactly. Thank you.
Edun Shagbe is one of the earliest. In fact, perhaps one of the earliest Edun. You know what is peculiar about the place? The founder or the settler there